right, so what is a deductive fallacy? Fallacies are thinking errors that lead to an invalid argument. A deductive fallacy is a thinking error that's produced by not following those correct logical forms that we've been talking about, which is to assert the antecedent. I want to make sure that you remember that term. Deductive fallacies, such as asserting the consequent, lead to conclusions that do not necessarily follow the premises. So here is, instead of the argument that we had earlier, instead of asserting the antecedent, we are asserting the consequent. If Broca's area is damaged, then speech production will be impaired. That's perfect. The minor premise here is Bill's speech will be impaired. They are asserting the consequent. Speech production will be impaired. Bill's speech is impaired. The conclusion, therefore, Broca's area in Bill's brain has been damaged. The conclusion is discussing the antecedent. So they've got these two things backwards. How we had it before is that Bill's brain had been, Broca's area had been damaged. This is wrong. So perhaps Broca's area and Bill's brain's been damaged, but perhaps Bill has a speech impediment. Maybe Bill just doesn't want to talk today. There's all kinds of reasons that Bill could be having some type of speech impairment. This is hard parsing out these parts of the argument, but you have to be able to do that to think about them logically and to create proper arguments yourself. Here's another example. So if people smile, then they are happy. Jenny just won the lottery and is happy, therefore she's smiling. Not necessarily true. The book, the way they describe it is maybe she doesn't smile because she has some type of issue with her mouth and she can't smile. Maybe this is funny the way the book puts it, maybe she's not smiling so her greedy relatives don't come after her to try to get her money. There's all different, the point is, there's all kinds of reasons that she might not be smiling, and so that this, when you're asserting the consequent, is not a good argument. Some other things that can happen when you're doing this is belief bias. It occurs when a person has prior knowledge or a belief that interferes with drawing a valid or sound conclusion. And this one fits perfect with this. So when you think that, oh, she won the lottery, she's happy, she's got to be smiling, that is a belief bias. You're basing that off of your previous experiences and your previous thoughts that when people are happy, they're smiling. It's not always the case. So concluding that she is smiling may seem true to you based off of your knowledge that people who are happy usually smile. It's not a logical conclusion. It is displaying this belief bias. On improving theories, so great thing about science is that it improves over time. The more research that we conduct, the better these theories get. And so like drive theory and social learning theory were competitors. They're not necessarily so much anymore because research has shown that social cognitive learning theories are superior and can more fully explain aggression. So at any given moment, we are using the best science that we know, but there are all kinds of things we don't know, and we learn about those things through that scientific process. The results have shown that social learning was superior to drive theory. So in science, you have to be a little bit almost flexible, and you realize there's always more to know. They're using the best information that you have currently at the time, and that may change in the future. One of the reasons that I'm mentioning that in here and now is because we're going to get into assumptions. There are these things sometimes in the back of arguments, these assumptions that maybe you don't say them out loud, but you are believing them, kind of like the belief bias. And they can kind of like foul up your arguments. So the definition for it is an assumption is an unstated premise that is taken for granted in an argument. Here's an example. If someone's nice to other people, then that person will be liked. Taylor is liked by many people. What's the assumption there? You might think about that for a second. What is the assumption in this statement? If someone is nice to other people, then that person will be liked. Taylor is liked by many people. The assumption there is that Taylor is nice. Maybe she's liked by many people, but maybe she's not so nice. Notice that also in this statement that the consequent has been asserted, as we discussed before. The argument may become valid if the missing premise, Taylor is nice, is asserted, and then the conclusion follows. And you have to be able to identify the assumptions to evaluate an argument, and most people are not very good at this. The big reason to think about assumption is because a lot of people have what's called unwarranted assumptions. So not only are they assumptions, but they are assumptions that are faulty and not necessarily true. That they're not justified or supported by a good reason, and it's taken for granted and it's kind of hidden in the argument. So you got two different things going on there. It's hidden and it's unjustified, and it can lead to the wrong conclusion. The author of the textbook described a situation where he thought that college football players were not good students. And so that was a stereotype that he had, and it was an unwarranted assumption. And he was surprised to learn that one of the best students he had was actually played varsity football through the college. Even your textbook author can fall for some of these tricks that we do to ourselves. Anyways, to recognize the unwarranted assumptions, let's look at an example here. See if you can figure out the unwarranted assumption here in this story. The teachers and the principals of a school system sought to improve the test scores of all their students by raising students' self-esteem. During the entire year, they implemented strategies to improve self-esteem. At the end of the year, no improvements could be found. So then they concluded that self-esteem did not improve their students' test scores. So what unwarranted assumption did they have in there? They had assumed that self-esteem would, by raising self-esteem, you would raise test scores. And the research does not support that. Basically, the missing major premise here is if educators improve the self-esteem of the students, the test performance will improve. This was actually a widely held belief in the 1980s. It was a misconception that if you raise self-esteem, you would raise also things like test scores. The assumption was shown to be unwarranted when there was no substantial increase observed in those things. Although it may be true that better students tend to have higher self-esteem than poor students, that does not necessarily imply that raising self-esteem will improve their academic skills. There's all kinds of things going on there. Maybe you have high self-esteem because you're doing well in school. What you want to raise, according to the research, is you want to raise self-efficacy. You want to make the students feel like they can actually do well, and then their self-esteem will go up. It's almost the other way around. So on finding these unwarranted assumptions, you want to look for those missing premises and make them explicit. And then you want to look for evidence supporting each assumption. An unwarranted assumption is not going to be supported by good evidence. Like this, when they tried to raise self-esteem to raise test scores, there wasn't any evidence that that would work. It was just a guess. They were like, this seems like it will work. It's kind of one of those common sense ideas. Here's another example. Maybe you have a student and they're like, you know what? I'm going to be a great psych major. All the classes will be super easy for me because I watch a lot of TV talk shows and I've learned a lot about people and human behavior through those shows. So those classes will be easy for me. What's the unwarranted assumption there? That if people watch TV shows concerning human issues, they'll learn about psychology. If you're watching the show like, I don't know if they have these shows anymore, but shows like Jerry Springer, you're not learning about psychology there. Not the kind that you're going to learn about in a psychology class. Let's put it that way. All right, in the next slides, we'll talk about some thinking errors.